There is a man in the Bible who never had a funeral. No grave was ever dug for him. No body was ever buried. In a book filled with death, from the very first chapters, one man simply disappears. One moment he is walking the earth. The next moment, he is gone. Not killed, not sick, not old and fading away like everyone around him. Just gone. And the Bible gives us only one line to explain it. A line so short, so strange, that people have been trying to understand it for thousands of years. His name was Enoch. And what happened to him may be one of the strangest, most overlooked mysteries in the entire book of Genesis. To understand why his story is so unusual, you have to understand what surrounds it. Genesis chapter 5 is often skipped over by readers. It looks like a simple list of names. A genealogy. Person after person, born, lived a certain number of years, had children, and died. Adam lived, then he died. Seth lived, then he died. Enoch lived, then he died. Over and over the same pattern repeats. Birth, life, death. It is almost like a drumbeat, page after page, reminding the reader of one unavoidable truth, Ebriandiet, and then the pattern breaks. When the text reaches Enoch, something changes. The rhythm that has repeated again and again suddenly stops. Instead of the expected ending, instead of the word died, Genesis gives us something no other person in that entire chapter receives. It says Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No death, no burial, no closing statement like everyone else. Just taken. For the first readers of Genesis, this must have been shocking, in a world where death was constant, where every name before him ended the same way. One man simply stepped outside the rule that governed everyone else, and Scripture does not fully explain how. It does not describe the moment. It does not tell us what Enoch saw, or felt, or experienced. It simply tells us the result. He was gone. So the question becomes obvious. Who was this man? And why him? To understand Enoch, we have to look at the short description Genesis gives us of his life. According to Genesis chapter 5, Enoch lived 65 years, and then he became the father of a son named Methuselah. After that, the text says something remarkable. It says, Enoch walked with God for 300 years, and had other sons and daughters. In total, Genesis tells us Enoch lived 365 years. Then comes that final, unforgettable sentence. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That phrase, walked with God, appears only in reference to two people in the entire book of Genesis. Enoch is one of them. The other is Noah, a man who would go on to survive the flood. This detail alone tells us something important. To walk with God in the language of Genesis was not a small compliment. It described a relationship, a closeness, a life so aligned with God that Scripture singles it out as rare and remarkable, even in a time when humanity's wickedness was growing. But here, we run into our first real mystery. What does it actually mean to walk with God? The Bible does not give us a detailed explanation. It does not describe conversations between Enoch and God. It does not tell us about visions, or miracles, or dramatic encounters. It gives us a single phrase, repeated twice in just a few verses, and lets it stand as the entire summary of a man's life. 300 years of walking with God, condensed into one line. Some interpreters understand this to describe an ongoing, daily closeness with God, a life defined by faith and obedience rather than by any single dramatic event. Others see it as pointing to something deeper, a relationship so intimate that it stood in stark contrast to the world around him. Scripture does not tell us exactly which is correct. What it does tell us is the outcome of that walk. And that outcome is where the real mystery begins. Because Enoch did not die. In a chapter built entirely around the certainty of death, Enoch's story ends differently. He was not, that is the phrase used, not he died, not he passed away. He simply was not, as though he had stepped out of the normal order of existence entirely. For thousands of years, readers have asked the same question. What actually happened to Enoch? Did he die in a way the text simply does not describe? Was he taken up into heaven while still alive? Did his body cease to exist in this world altogether? Genesis does not answer this directly, but there is another passage in Scripture that gives us more insight, and it comes from the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 11 is often called the faith chapter of the Bible, because it lists example after example of people who trusted God even when they could not see the full picture. And right there, among the great heroes of faith, is Enoch. Hebrews 11, verse 5, tells us that by faith Enoch was taken up so that he did not see death. And he was not found, because God had taken him. And before he was taken, Hebrews adds, he was commended as one who pleased God. This is one of the most important clues we have. Hebrews confirms what Genesis only hints at. Enoch did not simply vanish by chance. According to Hebrews, he did not experience death at all. He was, in some way we are not given full details about, taken directly by God, while he was still walking this earth. Think about how extraordinary that is. In the story of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, death is described as the great enemy, the consequence introduced after sin entered the world, something every human being must eventually face. And yet here, in the middle of a genealogy filled with death, one man is lifted out of that reality entirely. But this raises another question. If death is the result of sin entering the world, and if every human being inherits that reality, why would God spare Enoch from it? Scripture does not give us a direct explanation for why Enoch specifically was chosen for this. What it does give us, again, is that description of his relationship with God. He walked with God. He pleased God, according to Hebrews. And it was because of that faith, that closeness, that his story ended the way it did. This is where many people mistakenly begin filling in gaps that Scripture leaves open. Over the centuries, all kinds of traditions and stories developed around Enoch, especially in ancient Jewish writings outside the Bible. Some of these texts describe elaborate visions, journeys through the heavens, and detailed conversations. It is important to understand something here. Those writings are not part of the Bible. They are not considered scripture by Jewish or Christian tradition, and the Bible itself does not confirm the details found in them. When it comes to Enoch, our reliable, scriptural source is limited to a handful of verses in Genesis, one confirming passage in Hebrews, and one additional reference we will get to shortly. Anything beyond that moves from biblical fact into speculation, and it is important not to confuse the two. So what can we actually know for certain, based on Scripture alone? We know Enoch lived at a time before the flood, a period Genesis describes as increasingly filled with human wickedness. We know he was the father of Methuselah, whose name appears later in the same genealogy, and whose extraordinarily long lifespan places him as a direct link to the years leading up to the flood of Noah. We know Enoch walked with God for 300 years, and we know that, unlike every other name listed around him, Enoch's life did not end in death, but in being taken by God. There is one more piece of the puzzle, and it comes from a place many readers overlook entirely. The small New Testament letter of Jude, verses 14 and 15, tells us that Enoch prophesied, saying that the Lord would come with countless holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to convict every person of their ungodly deeds. This is the only place in Scripture where we are told Enoch spoke a prophecy, and it is a striking one. In a world sliding deeper into corruption, Enoch is described as a man who spoke about a coming judgment, a day when God would hold humanity accountable. Put these pieces together, and a picture begins to form. Enoch lived during a dark and increasingly corrupt period in early human history. Rather than being shaped by the world around him, he walked closely with God. He is remembered as someone who pleased God through faith. He spoke about coming judgment, and in the end, his life did not conclude the way every other life in that chapter concluded. He did not die. Was taken. This is where the story reaches its deepest point of meaning, because Enoch's account is not simply a strange historical curiosity. Within the structure of Genesis 5, surrounded by generation after generation ending in death, Enoch stands as a single, striking exception, and Scripture seems to present him this way intentionally. In the middle of a chapter that reminds us again and again that sin leads to death, one man's life whispers a different possibility, that a life devoted to walking with God can end in something other than the grave. For the original audience of Genesis, and for the writer of Hebrews centuries later, Enoch's story likely carried a message of hope. It suggested that closeness with God was not merely a moral aspiration, but something that mattered profoundly, something with real consequences, even eternal ones. Hebrews places Enoch within a long list of people commended for their faith, positioning his story not as an isolated oddity, but as an early example of a truth that would be repeated throughout Scripture, that faith in God is what pleases him, and that those who seek him will not be overlooked. And yet, even with all of this, the mystery is never fully resolved. Scripture does not tell us where Enoch was taken. It does not describe what happened to him in the moment he disappeared from the earth. It does not tell us what his life looked like after that point. These are details that remain outside of what has been revealed to us. Perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps some mysteries are left exactly as mysteries, not because the answer does not exist, but because it is not ours to fully know in this life. What we are given is enough to understand the meaning behind the mystery, even without every detail behind the event itself. But Enoch's story does not exist in isolation, because there is only one other place in the entire Bible where something similar happens. Centuries later, another man would also leave this world without experiencing an ordinary death. A prophet, taken up in a whirlwind, witnessed by someone who watched it happen in real time. His name was Elijah. And when you place these two accounts side by side, Enoch at the very beginning of human history, and Elijah appearing much later in the story of Israel, a much larger and even more fascinating pattern begins to emerge. One that stretches across the entire Bible and points toward questions about life, death, and what it truly means to walk with God. Questions that Scripture continues to explore all the way to its final pages. If you want to understand where that pattern leads, and how Elijah's disappearing act connects to Enoch, in a way that some believe echoes all the way into the final book of the Bible, then Enoch's story is only the beginning of a much bigger mystery. Subscribe, and stay with us, because the next chapter of this story is where things get even more remarkable.